Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through CHOW and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness. Good morning. Welcome to Encounter. I'm your host this week, Jeff Kellam. I serve as the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church in Endicott. When I was growing up there in the Union District of Endicott, one of the highlights of every summer is when the WNBF radio show wagon would come to town for a few days to help promote some of the Union District merchants, when there were some. And the show wagon was made up of maybe a 35-foot house trailer that had been converted into a radio studio. I think they were a little bit more modest one year when the Volkswagen microbus showed up. It was a studio as well. One of the DJs spinning the records on WNBF at the time, because they were a music format station, guys changed, I think every 3 or 4 hours, a different DJ would come on. One of them was Tom Whalen, and he often announced himself as Thomas Michael Whalen. I thought that was pretty cool when I went to college to use my full name on the radio, so I was Jeffrey Stanton Kellam. Little did I realize that Stanton was a name very familiar, especially to people in central New York, because of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I didn't know much about her growing up. I knew there was an Edwin Stanton who was the Secretary of War under Lincoln, but they weren't teaching women's history when I was in school back then, and probably not as much as they should now. So it's a good thing there's Women's History Month. And wanting to know a little bit more about my distant cousin, and we are related, I have the chart here to prove it, to talk a little bit about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her influence on history of the United States and women's history in particular, is Dr. Diane Sommerville from Binghamton University, yes. Professor of history there, and a member at Union Presbyterian Church.
I am.
That's convenient, isn't it?
It is, very convenient.
Tell me, let's start with Women's History Month. How long have we had a Women's History Month?
Well, it grew out of the women's movement of the 1970s. It started as a kind of local initiative out of a town in California. Momentum grew for a larger national celebration, and it first was National Women's History Week,
right.
And then under Carter, I believe in 1980, and then it took another 6 years before it graduated to an entire month.
Right. The idea of a Women's History Month, it's kind of sad that we need one. And just as we have Black History Month that began as a week,
correct,
became a month.
Right.
Women's History Month began as a week. The place of women's history overlooked for so long. Mm-hmm. I mean, did you study women's history when you were in school?
Well, actually, I went to college in the 70s when it was just blossoming.
Yeah.
And so when I took very traditional political and military history courses, and I got very little, if any, women's history. But when I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school, that's really where I was interested. I became much more interested and intrigued, and where I learned a little bit more about Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah. Now, I'm just curious now, what led you into history? You were interested in history in college. Mm-hmm. Was it a history major then? It
was. I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania, which is an area where there is a lot of history, 18th century colonial history. The French and Indian War happened right down the road, Fort Ligonier. And even on my family farm, we knew that there was an Indian settlement because my father and his siblings, when they would plow the fields, were always turning up arrowheads and even tomahawk heads. And so that cultivated my own interest in history, and I won the 8th grade history award. I went on to major in history and then to get my PhD in history.
Right. Wow, that's wonderful. I won an award too in high school. It was the American Dental Association Award. I had the correct number of teeth probably in the test. I don't know. And I thought about going into dentistry. So unlike you,
Yes,
I changed
yes.
course. But you became, and of course, the more you study history, the more involving and enticing it is, isn't it?
It is. And I spent a little bit of time in the late 80s living in North Carolina, and that's where I became very interested in Southern history. And so I've written 2 books on Southern history, and but at the university I teach women's history as well as Southern history and the Civil War.
Yeah. So there is a women's history course at Binghamton University.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. How did you build the curriculum for that? The syllabus that you hand out?
Well, the Binghamton University History Department has a very long-standing foundational platform for women's history. We had 2 pioneers in women's history, Kitty Sklar and her husband Tom Dublin. So they started years ago with women's history, and so I've had that to build on. But you have to upkeep the syllabus, make it more interesting. So I've evolved, and I teach a lot more about sex and sexuality. The course I'm teaching right now is Sex in American History, actually.
Oh my! Oh, we should talk about that sometime.
Yes.
But let's go back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Sure, sure.
My cousin Katie.
Yes.
And growing up, I have to admit, Katie sounded like Katie.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's her maiden name.
Yes.
Pardon the expression. So she has certainly a home, or had a home in upstate New York, in Auburn, was it?
No, actually, she her parents had a place in Johnstown, New York. She got married. She lived in Boston. She lived in New York City for a while, but she is mostly associated with Seneca Falls.
Yeah, yeah. And she came from a pretty well-off, affluent family.
She did. Her mother was a Livingston. Of the 18th century Revolutionary War Livingstons, and the family money really came from that. Her father was an attorney who was really an attorney farmer, and he had to build up his reputation and wealth. He served as a judge for a while and a state assemblyman, and I think he actually served for a term in the U.S. Congress. But she grew up affluent, very comfortable, unlike a lot of other activists in the women's movement.
Yeah, so not necessarily a headstrong, liberation-oriented activist. She was quite comfortable where she was.
Yes, yes.
Until she met Henry.
Well, actually, I would suggest that she actually had these internal unsettled feelings about women's place. She grew up being told that her brothers were more valued than she was. Her parents had 4 sons, 3 of whom died in childbirth, and then the eldest graduated college and died at age 20. So her parents were left with no sons. And her father was always bemoaning the fact that she was not a son.
Wow.
And so she carried that emotional burden with her entire life. But because her father was an attorney, she had access to his library. And there were clients coming in and law students who wanted to study with him. And there was a moment when a woman came to him. She had some property, her husband died, and she was passed over, and the property was given to her ne'er-do-well son. And she was trying to find a legal way to challenge that. And Elizabeth's father said, "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do." And even as a child, she said, "I'll help. I'll cut out that law from the book, and then you don't have to worry about that."
My gosh.
So she had this, from a very young age, she wanted to go to college. There was one episode in which, after she went to Emma Willard Seminary in Troy, New York, she came home, and with a group of women, she raised money to send a minister to seminary. And he came back and betrayed them, in a sense, by giving his first sermon on the inferiority of women. And they were all sitting there in the front row,
Yeah.
and they got up, she led them, they got up and walked out. So I would suggest that yes, her abolitionist teeth were cut when she was an adult, after being introduced to her husband Henry and her cousin Garrett Smith, who was a very famous abolitionist.
Yeah.
But she had these inclinations that I think the exposure to the abolitionist movement honed. They were there from a very early age.
Yeah. So the abolitionist movement was one that had attracted Henry B. Stanton, and his activism was such that it was kind of off-putting to her father, who was
Yes.
very affluent lawyer, farmer lawyer. Henry was making his money on the circuit, I guess, just going from place to place, rallying the abolitionist troops, so to speak.
Not a whole lot of money in that.
Yeah, and then she was quite taken, apparently. She went to one of his speeches and was quite taken by his oratory and his fervor for the freedom of slaves. And so she, I guess, took an interest in him at that point.
Yes.
And the rest of that story is kind of interesting because it's kind of short.
Well, yes, her father did not approve of the marriage, and they got engaged nonetheless. But then she grew a little bit unsettled because of the disapproval, and she broke off the engagement. But then they, reconnected, and they married nonetheless.
Yeah.
And then immediately went off to Europe, as a lot of sort of middle and upper class women and men did at that time, went through Europe. And it just so happened that there was an international anti-slavery convention that was meeting in London at the time, and so she tagged along. And this is the famous impetus for women's rights in the United States, because she went there, she met Lucretia Mott there, the very famous Quaker female activist. She founded the Female Anti-Slavery Society of Philadelphia. And as they were entering the hall, the women were told that they couldn't sit on the floor with their husbands, who were the delegates. They had to move off to the side. So metaphorically and realistically, they were being excluded behind a screen, no less.
Yeah.
And that pricked their outrage at the way they were being treated as second-class citizens.
And that was true in this country, too, with the American anti-slavery movement, that women, the role of women kind of, again, they were interested in being abolitionists, but they weren't counted, their vote wasn't counted because they weren't allowed to vote at
That's
first,
right.
I suppose. So this was happening in England, where she got it really close up. By the way, when I mentioned that this was a short story, I meant their courtship was like 2 weeks.
Oh, yes,
and then they
yes.
decided to get married. I mean, it was just very fast.
Well, I have to think that some of that had to do with the fact that she was very unhappy growing up in a small town in upstate rural New York. And this was a very exciting opportunity for her to break out and to follow her husband.
Yeah,
Indeed.
right.
Indeed.
So they come back from England, and what are the next steps in her?
Well, she, for a period of time, she lives in Boston with her husband. He's an attorney, and so he has some work in Boston. And this is really the time in her life when she's most intellectually invigorated, because she's also acquainted with the transcendentalists in and around Boston, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and so she's really living the high life. And this is the first time, and she's always expressed a kind of intellectual hunger. She called it a mental hunger. And so she spent time there, and then he moved back to upstate New York. This is where I think they moved to Seneca Falls. And she's now upset again because she's in a small town, and she's really struggling to kind of get her teeth into something. And it just so happened that Lucretia Mott's sister lives in Seneca Falls. So Mott was visiting in the summer of 1848. Elizabeth is invited to dinner and reunites with Mott, and they're like, remember when we were in London and we were excluded? We ought to do something about that.
Yeah.
And so they put together on very short notice a convention of sorts. They didn't think that it was a locally constituted convention. They didn't think there would be that many people there. And lo and behold, before the convention ended, there were over 300 people in attendance, including notables like Frederick Douglass.
So men were there.
Yes.
Yep. And Frederick Douglass, I'd forgotten that his story interchanged
Yes.
with that of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yeah, interestingly, they were so new to this notion of having meetings and discussing women's rights that they didn't have anybody in place with experience to organize and lead the convention. So they asked Lucretia Mott's husband if he would be the one to lead it, which is ironic, right?
Yeah.
But yes, men weren't there the first day, but they did show up the second day.
Right. I just want to remind us that our guest today is Dr. Diane Sommerville, Professor of History at Binghamton University. And we're talking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton because of my personal interest in her. My middle name, Stanton, is my grandmother's maiden name. So my family wanted to carry on that name, and so I was given it as my middle name, which I use proudly every once in a while. So now we're at a point where the Women's Convention is held.
Yes.
What was that like? What was the tenor of the gathering?
Well, you know, I would
we're
also...
talking about Seneca Falls.
Seneca Falls.
In a chapel?
Yes, it was held in a chapel.
Wesleyan Chapel.
Yes, very good. What I would say is that this is really probably the most important marker in women's history in the United States, because out of that convention came the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. And this was the brainchild of Cady Stanton. And it is based on the Declaration of Independence, and that was very strategic because they wanted to fall back on a patriotic document that everybody knew, which of course is celebrating its 250th anniversary this year. And so it begins when in the course of human events, and it talks about the rights of men and women that are being oppressed and infringed upon. And then it becomes justified to overthrow the tyranny of patriarchy, essentially.
Yeah, right.
And like the Declaration of Independence, it outlines 18 grievances. Many people may not realize that women had married women particularly had many restrictions on them. They could not claim to have the rights to their own wages. Divorce was very rare, but in the cases of divorce or separation, women were not entitled to the custody of their own children. Married women could not own property. And this was a holdover from the British legal convention called coverture, where women's identity who married is the legal premise was when a man and wife marry, they become one. Of course, that one is the husband. So there were a lot of infringements on married women's rights, and so these were addressed in the grievances. And so that became the clarion call for reform for women. There were additional resolutions that were passed. The most controversial one, of course, was suffrage for women, the right to vote. And this was seen as so radical that the convention split, in part because there was worry that it would alienate that middle ground that was persuadable to come on board for women's rights. And it took actually a very moving speech by Frederick Douglass to say, that the women can't secure these rights unless they have the means to do so. And so the convention did pass a resolution in support of women's suffrage. It was very controversial, but of course it took a generation for that to come to being.
Not exactly unrelated, I went to seminary in the capital of the Confederacy in Richmond in the 60s when the Civil Rights era was heating up, so to speak. And the newspaper editorial writers were the ones who were most entrenched in the tradition of segregation, or at least separate but equal. What were the editorial writers? What was the public's view of this thing in Seneca Falls that the women had put together?
Well, it was very vitriolic. It was very condemning of these women who were asking for these rights. This was, there was religion at the center of this, right? Marriage was sacred. It was ordained by God. And so later in life, she begins to, not even too much, very much later, she begins to advocate for divorce reform because divorce was so rare, they couldn't, women couldn't leave an abusive marriage, and so she was working for that. But one of the reasons that it was facing such opposition, including the editorials of the newspapers, but also clergymen and others, was that this was deemed to be the breaking of a sacred bond that had been made in front of God. And so, no, I mean, it was very, sometimes very cruel. Some of the things that were said in print about people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, typically they would make allusions to their sex, that they were overstepping and were mannish.
Yeah.
They were acting like men.
And some of the more, pardon the expression, liberal clergy who were quite supportive of abolition,
Right.
Were not so supportive of women's rights.
In fact, I don't know if you know about the Grimke sisters. These were South Carolina sisters who had grown up in a slaveholding household, and they moved to Philadelphia and became very, very active and involved in abolition. And they were giving talks to mixed audiences. That meant they were speaking to men and women. And the clergy of New England, particularly Boston, put together a circular and denounced what the Grimkes were doing and said, you basically are stepping outside your bonds of womanhood. You're acting like men. And this is virtually sinful, but also made references to them being mannish, questioning their sexuality, actually.
Yeah. And this is, again, it's New York State history as well as national history because of the Seneca Falls connection. Now, this was 1848 that the convention was held. Were there other conventions that followed this?
So what happens is that there are, yes, local conventions throughout the country, smaller meetings that were held. But in the meantime, several years later, there's Elizabeth Cady Stanton develops a relationship with Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah.
And that's the very famous partnership that really propels the movement forward. They are an unlikely pair in certain ways, but they have this ability to work well together. They're very complementary to one another. In fact, Susan B. Anthony comes and stays with the Stantons. Stanton actually ended up having 7 children, and that was her excuse. I can't write because I have all these children. Well, Susan would come, and they called her Aunt Susan, and she would take care of the children so that Elizabeth could work on her speeches or her columns.
Yeah, so Susan B. Anthony was never married.
No.
Didn't have children to watch over.
And it becomes a sore subject between the two of them. She basically said, stop having babies. You need to focus on the cause.
Yeah, right. And to say that to a mother who loves her adorable children is a very difficult thing. But, when you think about, let's say, 1850 to 1920, we're talking about, quickly, 70 years before the 19th Amendment is passed.
Well, don't forget there was a Civil War in there, and that disrupted the women's movement. In fact, this is one of the points of contention between Stanton and Anthony. Anthony wanted to continue with women's reform movement. She thought they had momentum and didn't want it to stop. But Stanton believed that they should put their efforts behind being supportive of the Union war effort, making clothing for the soldiers, sending them food, etc., and that we will be rewarded for our loyalty afterwards. And then, of course, continuing to support abolition. And Anthony disagreed, and of course Anthony proved to be right because they were not rewarded with suffrage after the Civil War. It took quite some time. And this actually becomes another important moment in the movement because after the Civil War, of course, the 14th and 15th Amendments are passed, and for the very first time we have the word male inserted into the 14th Amendment, and that just infuriated Stanton and Anthony and the movement because they had been working so hard for the rights of women, and they expected that they were going to be rewarded for their loyalty by getting the right to vote. And that caused a split in the movement between Stanton and Anthony and Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, and they formed two different, actually, suffrage organizations as a consequence of that.
Yeah. And this was happening with political parties, too.
Yes.
Was it the Liberty Party at one point? And
Yes, that was formed in, I think, 1840, and it was formed largely from abolitionists who wanted to use the political party system, but it didn't really go anywhere.
And it doesn't help any cause when you don't have a united front.
No.
And so that explains why it took so long for us to finally get another amendment that gave women the right to vote. So were there any other, and there must have been another couple of places where something happened on the way to that 19th Amendment? And we have we have a minute.
Okay. No, so what happened was the split occurs in, I think, 1869, and they recognized that it's not helping the movement. And so late in the century, they decide to, I think in the 1890, maybe 1888, they reunite. Elizabeth Cady Stanton does take the leadership role, but at that point there's also a new generation of leadership, and there becomes differences of opinions about approaches, and then eventually, sadly, Cady Stanton, very ill, dies in 1902. Anthony dies in 1905. And the old stalwarts are gone, but the second generation is able, largely because of their efforts in World War I, in supporting the war effort. They are eventually rewarded with suffrage.
Right. And Susan B. Anthony gets the dollar coin, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, gosh,
it's nothing.
That doesn't seem fair, does it? No. Thank you. This is
my
wonderful.
pleasure.
We could go on.
We could.
I realize there's more to her life. I've been reading this book called An Uncommon Union, which is about Henry B. Stanton and the emancipation of Elizabeth Cady. And also, when we were talking about their marriage, the tradition was that she would be Elizabeth C. Stanton after she got married, but she insists on putting that Cady in there.
Yes, which was very unconventional for the time.
Yeah. So thank you again.
Thank you. My
Dr.
pleasure.
Diane Sommerville is professor of history at Binghamton University, currently teaching, the name of your, what course?
Currently, I'm teaching Sex in American History and the Civil War.
Two separate ones,
Yes,
right? Okay,
yes.
okay, I'm glad we got that straight. Again, thank you for being
pleasure.
my guest today as we talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton during this Women's History Month. I'm Jeff Kellam, thank you for being with us, and thanks to WBNG TV for the production facilities here, and to the Town Square media stations for playing the audio track of our program, which is produced, I remind you, by the Broome County Council of Churches, full of ministries that serve the community. This is one part of their ministry, and you can find the rest of the things that the Broome County Council of Churches does on their website. If you just Google Broome County Council of Churches, you'll get the whole enchilada there. Joe Selapak will be here, speaking of enchiladas, next week as we continue our series of conversations in the community. Again, Jeff Kellam reminding you now to be gentle with people and with yourself.